beaten, broken, abandoned, until a cowboy found the mail-order bride Clara had never known a life filled with warmth or comfort. From the very beginning, the world seemed determined to test her strength. Her parents had passed away when she was barely old enough to remember their faces clearly, leaving her in the care of distant relatives who viewed her more as an obligation than a member of the family. Every day in that house was a quiet struggle. The relatives' words were often sharp and unkind, their actions reminding her constantly that she was unwanted. When she reached out for attention or affection, she was met with cold indifference or, sometimes, a scolding that made her feel even smaller. As a child, Clara learned quickly how to make herself invisible. She moved softly through the house, speaking only when spoken to, keeping her hands busy with chores and tasks that distracted her from the emptiness she felt inside. She found solace in small things, the soft light of dawn filtering through the window, the way the wind rustled through the trees, or the quiet moments when she could sit alone and imagine a different life, one where she was safe, loved, and free to dream without fear. But dreams felt fragile, easily broken by the harsh words and cold stares of those around her. School brought no relief. She was shy and timid, cautious of those who might mock her or push her aside. Other children laughed and played, but Clara often sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, watching from a distance. She envied their freedom and their laughter, but she dared not join them. There was always the fear that she would be judged, that she would make a mistake and be reminded once again of her place as someone invisible, someone easily overlooked. Her notebooks became her companions, filled with sketches and stories about places she would never see, people who loved her unconditionally, and adventures that could never be real in the world she knew. When she grew older, life outside the house became just as difficult as life inside it. After finishing school, she took any work she could find, though jobs were scarce in her small town. She swept floors, washed dishes, and cleaned homes for people who barely noticed her presence. Long days turned into longer nights, and paychecks were barely enough to cover food and rent. Each day, Clara walked through the streets carrying a heavy load of exhaustion and anxiety, yet never complaining. She had learned that complaining drew attention, and attention brought judgment. People whispered as she passed, casting sideways glances and making assumptions about her life. She tried to ignore them, telling herself that their words could not touch her, but deep down, their judgment stung more than she wanted to admit. Despite the hardships, Clara clung to hope. She believed that somewhere beyond the limits of her small town, there was a life waiting for her, a life where she could be valued and respected. She spent her evenings reading whatever books she could find, imagining herself in new worlds filled with beauty and kindness. She wrote letters to herself about what she wanted, though she never sent them anywhere. These letters were a secret dialogue, a way to remind herself that she deserved more than the life she was living. Every night before closing her eyes, she would whisper promises to herself. That one day she would find safety, that one day she would find someone who saw her worth, that one day she would belong. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Clara's life took an unexpected turn. As she was reading an old newspaper she had found tucked away in a corner of the town library, a small advertisement caught her eye. It was simple, almost unremarkable at first glance, but the words carried a strange sense of possibility. A rancher out west was seeking a wife through correspondence. The ad spoke of a home, partnership, and a fresh start. For most, such a message might have seemed risky, even foolish. But for Clara, it was like a window opening in a wall she had thought was unbreakable. She read the ad again and again, feeling a flutter of excitement mingled with fear. The idea of leaving everything familiar, her town, her modest possessions, and even the painful routine of her current life, was terrifying. Yet at the same time, it was thrilling. It was a chance to step into a world where she could start over, where she could be valued and treated with kindness, where she could discover who she truly was without the constant shadows of judgment and neglect. For the first time in years, her mind filled not with worry but with possibility. After days of careful consideration, Clara began writing letters to the rancher. Each letter was cautious, polite, but also filled with honesty. She shared fragments of her life, her dreams, and the quiet longing for stability and affection. Weeks passed as the letters traveled back and forth. With every response, Clara felt a flicker of hope growing stronger. The rancher seemed kind, understanding, and respectful, everything she had dreamed of in a person who could offer her a safe and steady life. She told herself to be careful, to guard her heart, but she could not deny that for the first time she felt seen. Finally, after months of careful correspondence, a letter arrived that would change everything. The rancher invited her to come west, to meet him in person and begin a life together. Clara's heart raced with anticipation and fear. The decision to leave was not simple. She had no money, no real belongings, and no family to support her journey. Yet the promise of something better, something hopeful, outweighed the fear. She packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, carefully choosing the items that were most necessary and most comforting. A worn shawl that reminded her of home, a journal filled with her thoughts and dreams, and a small photo of her parents that she carried as a talisman. The night before her departure, Clara could hardly sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the stars, and imagined the life that awaited her. She pictured wide open fields, fresh air, and the possibility of kindness and love. She whispered promises to herself again, this time louder, more determined. "I will survive," she told herself. "I will find hope. I will not let fear control me." The journey itself was long and filled with uncertainty. Clara rode the train across landscapes she had never seen before, mountains, rivers, and plains stretching endlessly under wide skies. Each passing town and each new sight made her heart swell with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She wondered what awaited her at the end of the journey, whether the person she had corresponded with would truly be the partner she had imagined, or whether the promise of safety and companionship was only a fleeting hope. Along the way, she met other travelers, some kind and some indifferent. She observed families laughing together, couples holding hands, and strangers offering small gestures of help. These moments were small reminders that there were good people in the world, people who could make life bearable and even joyful. Clara clung to these glimpses of kindness, imagining that perhaps her own story could include such moments too. When the train finally approached its destination, Clara's heart beat faster than ever. She felt a swirl of emotions, fear of the unknown, hope for the future, and a quiet determination to face whatever came her way. She knew that once she stepped off the train, there would be no turning back. This journey was not just about reaching a new place. It was about stepping into a life she had longed for, leaving behind the pain, the neglect, and the loneliness of her past. As she gathered her suitcase and prepared to step onto the platform, Clara took a deep breath. She reminded herself of every lesson she had learned in her difficult life. How to endure, how to survive, how to keep hope alive even when the world seemed against her. She whispered one final promise to herself, a promise that would carry her forward through the uncertainty that lay ahead. "I will not be broken. I will find my place. I will discover my strength." With that, she stepped off the train, ready to face the next chapter of her life, one that would test her courage, her resilience, and her capacity to trust. She did not yet know the challenges that awaited her, nor the people she would meet who would change the course of her life. But for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a sense of possibility that was brighter and more real than she had dared to hope for. And in that moment, as the wind brushed her face and the horizon stretched wide before her, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she could finally belong, a life where she could be seen, valued, and loved for exactly who she was. When Clara arrived at the ranch, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, wide and open, with nothing but the sound of the wind brushing through the tall grasses and the distant lowing of cattle. The sky above was vast and blue, seemingly endless, but the beauty of it only made her feel smaller, more alone. Her heart pounded as she stepped off the wagon that had brought her from the train station, and for a moment, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. A man stood near the house, watching her as she approached. His letters had described him as kind and patient, a man who wanted a partner to share life's burdens and joys. But as Clara looked into his eyes now, she felt a coldness there that the letters had never revealed. His face was stern, his smile brief and strained, and there was a tension in his posture that made her uneasy. He greeted her with a nod rather than warmth, and Clara felt her stomach tighten. She reminded herself that first impressions could be misleading, that perhaps he was simply shy or cautious. After all, she had traveled across the country for this chance. She could not let fear or doubt stop her now. The house itself was large, made of weathered wood, and surrounded by fences that enclosed the cattle and stretched into the horizon. It was a hard, lonely place, unlike anything Clara had known. There were no neighbors nearby, no children playing in the yards, no bustling streets to provide distraction or comfort. The isolation, which she had imagined as freedom during her train journey, now felt heavy and intimidating. Every step she took echoed in the quiet house, a reminder that she was entirely alone. At first, Clara tried to stay positive. She unpacked her small suitcase, arranging her few belongings neatly in the rooms she was assigned. She tidied the house, swept the floors, and prepared simple meals, hoping that her efforts would be appreciated. She told herself that this was just the beginning, that over time she would earn his respect and perhaps even his friendship. But as the days passed, she began to notice the subtle signs of disapproval in his behavior. He would comment on her cooking, saying the food was not seasoned correctly. He would remark on the way she cleaned, insisting that she had missed spots even when the house shone. Even the way she spoke seemed to irritate him at times, as if her very voice was an offense. Clara worked tirelessly from morning until night, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and managing the household chores. The ranch was demanding, and every day brought new challenges, fixing broken water lines, guiding the cattle, chopping wood for the stove, and making sure every task was done to perfection. Exhaustion settled into her muscles, and yet she refused to complain. She had learned early that complaining drew attention, and attention often brought judgment. Instead, she focused on each task, determined to prove her worth even when it felt impossible. But no matter how hard she tried, nothing seemed to satisfy him. He criticized her at every opportunity, his words sharp and cutting. Clara began to shrink in his presence, walking more quietly, speaking less, and constantly second-guessing herself. The kindness she had imagined when writing letters seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of a man who demanded obedience, but offered no warmth. Each day, she felt herself slipping further into fear and uncertainty, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in trusting the promise of a new life. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. The ranch was so isolated that even small acts of connection were impossible. Clara could see the horizon stretching for miles, but there were no neighbors to visit, no friends to talk to, no one to offer guidance or reassurance. Nights were the worst. After the sun sank below the hills, the house seemed to close in on her, and every sound, the creaking of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind, the distant call of an owl, felt amplified in the darkness. She often lay awake in bed, her mind racing with questions and fears. Had she made a mistake? Was this life what she had risked everything for? Would she ever find kindness or comfort here, or was she destined to live in fear and silence? One winter evening, after a long day of tending to the cattle in freezing wind and snow, Clara experienced the full extent of her despair. Her husband had been particularly harsh that day, criticizing her for not working fast enough, for not anticipating his needs, for failing to meet the impossible standard he seemed to set for her. By nightfall, her hands were raw and aching, her body exhausted, and her spirit heavy. She sat quietly by the fire, trying to soothe herself with warmth and the small comfort of her journal. She wrote about the life she had dreamed of, the hope that had carried her across the country, and the painful reality she now faced. Her writing was a lifeline, a way to remind herself that she still had a voice, even when it seemed no one else would listen. She wrote about her fears, her doubts, her longing for kindness, and her desire to be seen as more than just labor. She wrote about the life she had imagined and the courage it had taken to leave everything familiar behind. And as she wrote, she allowed herself a small flicker of hope, however fragile that maybe, just maybe, things could change. But the change she had hoped for did not come from him. Instead, it came from the realization that she had to find strength within herself. She could not rely on him to offer comfort or support. She had to survive, endure, and protect herself in this lonely, demanding place. Each day, she reminded herself that she had survived hardship before, that she had faced neglect and judgment, and that she had always found a way to keep going. This memory of past resilience became her shield against despair, giving her the courage to continue even when her spirit felt heavy. As the weeks passed, Clara began to notice subtle patterns in her husband's behavior. There were times when he disappeared for days, leaving her entirely alone on the ranch. At first, She feared the worst, imagining accidents or conflicts that had nothing to do with her. But gradually, she realized that these absences were a form of control. When he returned, he would speak in harsh tones, criticizing her for every minor mistake that had occurred in his absence. The isolation, once overwhelming, became a tool he used to keep her uncertain and anxious. Clara felt the weight of his judgment pressing down on her, and yet she refused to let it break her entirely. She found small ways to reclaim her sense of self. She tended to her own garden, grew herbs and vegetables that reminded her of home, and found moments of quiet in the early mornings when the world was still and untouched. She sang softly to herself while working, a small rebellion against the silence that sought to confine her. She wrote letters she never sent, imagining a world where she could speak freely, where kindness and respect were abundant, and where she could be herself without fear. These small acts became her lifeline, a way to survive the emotional and physical demands of life on the ranch. Despite her struggles, Clara also discovered moments of unexpected beauty. She watched the sun rise over the rolling hills, painting the sky with colors she had never seen in her old town. She listened to the call of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the sound of the river as it wound through the property. These moments reminded her that the world was larger than her pain, that beauty could still exist even in the midst of hardship. She held onto these glimpses of wonder as proof that life could still offer hope, that one day she might find the life she had imagined in her letters and dreams. Yet the reality of her situation remained harsh. Her husband's criticisms were constant, his patience non-existent, and the work unending. Clara learned to move carefully, to anticipate his moods, and to perform each task with precision to avoid angering him. She became a master of quiet endurance, developing a strength she had not known she possessed. Every day was a test of resilience, every interaction a challenge, and yet she continued, holding on to the faint hope that one day circumstances might change. By the end of her first winter on the ranch, Clara felt both stronger and more fragile than ever before. She had survived brutal cold, long days of labor, and emotional neglect. She had endured criticism, harsh words, and isolation. And yet in the quiet moments, writing in her journal, tending to her garden, watching the sunrise, she discovered a strength and resilience that she had never fully recognized before. She realized that survival was not just about enduring hardship, but about finding the small sparks of hope and beauty that could guide her through even the darkest times. Clara also began to reflect on the life she had left behind, the family she had lost, and the dreams she had once carried across the country. She realized that while the ranch was not the life she had imagined, it was teaching her lessons she could not have learned anywhere else. She was learning patience, endurance, and the quiet power of inner strength. She was learning that hope could exist even in difficult circumstances, and that she could create small pockets of comfort and beauty even in a harsh, unforgiving environment. Through every challenge, Clara's heart held onto the fragile hope that her life could change, that she could find kindness, and that she could build a sense of belonging even in this lonely place. The journey she had begun with letters and dreams had brought her to a harsh reality, but it had also revealed a resilience she did not know she had. And in that resilience, she found the courage to keep moving forward, to face each day with determination, and to hold on to the belief that someday her life could be filled with the safety, respect, and companionship she had longed for since childhood. Spring arrived slowly on the ranch, bringing with it a gentle warmth that made the snow melt and the first green shoots appear among the dry grasses. Clara noticed the subtle changes in the land around her, the way the sun lingered longer in the sky, the soft fragrance of the earth after rain, and the distant songs of birds returning to the hills. For the first time in months, the beauty of the world around her made her pause. She walked slowly across the fields, feeling the soft earth beneath her boots, and allowed herself a small moment of quiet, imagining that perhaps the harshness of her life could soften too. It was on one such afternoon, as Clara struggled to mend a broken fence along the edge of the property, that she first saw him. A lone figure on horseback appeared on the horizon, moving steadily toward her. At first, she thought he was just another rancher checking his land, but as he drew closer, she noticed the calm and steady way he approached. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and rode with an ease that suggested years of experience. He looked up at her and tipped his hat in greeting, his eyes warm and clear. "Hello there," he called in a friendly voice. "Need a hand?" Clara hesitated, unsure whether to trust him. She had learned to be cautious with strangers, to guard her heart and her words. The life she had arrived into on the ranch had taught her that appearances could be deceiving. People could seem kind in letters or greetings, but reveal harshness in their actions. She studied the man for a moment, noting the sincerity in his eyes and the relaxed way he held the reins of his horse. There was no judgment in his stance, no impatience in his tone. Something about him felt different. I think I can manage," she replied cautiously, tightening her grip on the fence post. The man nodded, but he didn't push. Instead, he dismounted slowly and began to inspect the fence nearby, giving her space. Clara watched him work with quiet curiosity. His movements were confident but careful, showing respect for the land and the animals. He worked steadily, and though he said little, there was a presence about him that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in months. Over the following days, the man, whose name she learned was Daniel, made occasional visits to the ranch. He always spoke politely, never intruded, and always offered help in ways that respected her space. Sometimes he would stop by to check the fences, other times to deliver supplies or provide advice about the cattle. He never lingered longer than necessary, yet his quiet presence became a small comfort to Clara. She began to notice that he always treated her with respect, never criticism, never impatience. For someone who had spent months under harsh judgment and emotional neglect, this was a strange and beautiful relief. Clara found herself looking forward to his visits, not because she depended on him, but because his presence reminded her that there were people in the world who could be kind without expecting anything in return. She observed the way he interacted with the animals, his calm voice soothing a frightened calf, his steady hands guiding the horses. She realized that kindness could be quiet, unassuming, and patient. And slowly she began to allow herself to hope that perhaps her life could include such kindness too. One afternoon, as she repaired a small section of the barn roof, Daniel appeared with a gentle offer. "I noticed this board is loose. Mind if I help?" Clara hesitated. She had grown accustomed to working alone, accustomed to the constant feeling that asking for help was a weakness. But something in his voice and in the way he waited patiently for her answer reassured her. "Thank you," she said softly. Together, they worked on the roof. Daniel guided her hands when she was unsure, pointed out where the boards needed extra support, and offered small pieces of advice without judgment. For the first time in months, Clara felt capable again. She realized that help did not mean weakness. It could mean support, learning, and partnership. She felt a spark of gratitude that warmed her heart, and for a moment she allowed herself to forget the loneliness that had weighed on her for so long. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's presence became a gentle rhythm in her life. He never forced conversation, never pressed for personal details beyond what she was willing to share, and never judged her past. He noticed her exhaustion after long days, leaving small comforts, a warm blanket by the door, extra food when he saw her rationing meals too carefully. These gestures were quiet, unassuming, yet they meant more to Clara than words could express. She began to trust him, not fully, but enough to let down the walls she had built around herself. One evening, after her husband left the ranch without notice once again, Clara found herself alone, as she had so many times before. This time, however, she did not feel the same crushing fear. She had learned to endure his absence and the weight of his criticism. She had learned to find strength within herself. And now, Daniel was nearby. He had stopped by to check on the livestock and noticed the empty house and the tension in her posture. Without asking questions, he simply offered his presence, standing a respectful distance away, allowing her to process her emotions in her own time. Clara realized something profound in that quiet moment. She did not need to explain herself to anyone, did not need to justify her feelings or fears. Daniel's patience and understanding were a stark contrast to the harshness she had endured. She felt a small flicker of hope ignite within her, a hope that perhaps safety and kindness were possible, that she could belong somewhere, that she could find someone who would see her as a person worthy of respect and care. In the following weeks, Clara began to look for ways to regain her own sense of control and strength. She started small, tending to her garden with renewed energy, carefully choosing seeds and nurturing the plants as they grew. She began to explore the land around the ranch, learning the rhythm of the seasons, the habits of the animals, and the hidden beauty in the hills and valleys. With Daniel's occasional guidance, she learned more about ranch life than she had ever imagined, gaining confidence in her abilities and a quiet pride in her accomplishments. Daniel never overstepped, never demanded more than she was willing to give. He celebrated her successes quietly, with nods, smiles, and words of encouragement that made her feel seen for the first time in years. He listened when she spoke, without interruption, without judgment, and offered advice only when she asked. His respect and patience taught her a new kind of strength, the strength to trust, the courage to believe in kindness, and the ability to hope even when the past had been harsh. One spring afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky and painted the fields with golden light, Clara and Daniel found themselves walking together along a trail near the river. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh grass. They spoke of simple things, the work on the ranch, the patterns of the animals, and the beauty of the land around them. Daniel asked gentle questions about her childhood and her dreams, listening intently, never rushing her, never judging her past. Clara felt an unfamiliar sense of ease in his presence. She realized that she had been so accustomed to fear and criticism that she had forgotten what it felt like to be heard and valued. Daniel's kindness did not erase her pain, but it made her feel stronger, more capable of facing the challenges that remained. She began to understand that love and care could be patient, quiet, and steady, not loud or demanding. In these small moments, Clara discovered something she had long thought impossible. She could trust someone again. Not fully, not yet, but enough to allow herself to hope. She began to imagine a future where she could be safe, respected, and valued. She realized that her journey across the country had not been in vain. It had led her to someone who could help her rediscover her own strength and courage. Yet, even as she allowed herself to feel this hope, Clara knew that the road ahead would not be easy. She had endured neglect, criticism, and loneliness for so long that trusting fully would take time. She carried scars, both visible and invisible, that would not disappear overnight. But for the first time in months, she felt a spark of possibility, a belief that life could be different, that she could find joy and companionship, and that she could build a life where she was seen and appreciated for who she truly was. The presence of Daniel also reminded Clara that resilience was not just about surviving hardship, but about finding support when it was offered. She learned that accepting help was not a sign of weakness, but a way to grow stronger and regain hope. Each day, as they worked together or shared quiet moments, she felt a little more capable, a little more confident, and a little more certain that she could face the challenges that remained. By the end of spring, Clara's life had begun to change in small but significant ways. She still lived under harsh conditions with a husband who offered no warmth, but she had discovered an ally in Daniel, a steady, patient presence that reminded her of her own strength. She had begun to rebuild her confidence, to trust in kindness, and to believe that life could offer more than suffering and neglect. And though the future was uncertain, she knew that she was no longer entirely alone. For the first time since arriving on the ranch, Clara allowed herself to dream, not of escape, but of a life where she could belong, where she could be valued, and where she could find the peace and companionship she had longed for since childhood. The bond she was forming with Daniel was slow and cautious, but it was genuine, built on respect, patience, and quiet acts of kindness that made her feel alive again. And in the vast, open landscape of the ranch, with the wind whispering through the grasses and the sun painting the sky in colors of hope, Clara realized that perhaps this was the beginning of something new, a life where she could finally breathe, heal, and discover the meaning of companionship, strength, and trust. The months following spring brought steady change to the land and to Clara herself. The harsh winter had passed, leaving behind soft green fields and the gentle warmth of the sun. Flowers bloomed along the edges of the ranch, and the air carried the fragrance of fresh grass and growing crops. Clara noticed these changes with new eyes. What had once felt like a lonely, oppressive place now seemed filled with quiet possibilities. She could see the beauty of the world again, and with it came a renewed sense of courage. Clara had spent many long months learning the rhythm of the ranch, tending to animals, mending fences, and caring for the house, all under the cold oversight of her husband. He had never changed, never softened, never offered the kindness she had hoped for when she first arrived. Each day with him was a reminder that she had endured more than any person should have to endure alone. But through this struggle, she had discovered something even more important, her own inner strength. She had survived isolation, harsh criticism, and relentless work. She had learned that she could rely on herself, that her courage could carry her through even the darkest days. It was during one of these ordinary mornings, as she checked the fences and counted the cattle, that Clara realized she could no longer wait for her husband to change. She could no longer expect him to become the person who might finally offer her the respect, safety, and companionship she deserved. The truth was clear and undeniable. He would never be the partner she had imagined. And with that truth came a surge of determination. She had already survived far too much to remain in a life that left her spirit broken. The realization was both terrifying and freeing. She had left everything familiar once before to chase a promise of hope. Now she would leave again, but this time with full knowledge of what she deserved. She would take control of her own life, of her own happiness. She began to plan quietly, considering where she could go, what she would need, and how she would start over. Each thought filled her with a mixture of fear and excitement. She knew the journey ahead would not be simple, but for the first time she felt ready to face it. Daniel, the kind cowboy who had become a quiet presence in her life, noticed the change in her immediately. He had seen the small sparks of hope growing in her eyes over the past weeks, and he understood, without words, that Clara was preparing to reclaim her life. He never pressured her, never demanded explanations, but he was always there, a steady source of support and encouragement. His patience and respect had shown her that trust could exist, that someone could value her not for what she could do for them, but simply for who she was. When the moment came for Clara to leave, it was calm and deliberate. She packed her few belongings into a small bag, carefully choosing items that were essential and comforting. She included her journal, filled with memories, lessons, and dreams, a warm shawl that had traveled with her from home, and a small photo of her parents, a reminder of where she had come from and the resilience she had carried all along. She did not rush. She did not act in fear. Instead, she moved with quiet determination, fully aware that she was choosing herself and her future. Daniel helped her without hesitation, providing guidance on the safest route to the nearby town and offering supplies for her journey. He never took over, never made decisions for her. He simply stood beside her, giving her the confidence to take the next step on her own. Clara felt a wave of gratitude for his presence, but she knew that the courage to leave came from within. Daniel had shown her the way to trust again, but the action, the decision to reclaim her life, belonged entirely to her. The journey to the town was filled with moments of reflection. Clara thought about the life she had left behind on the ranch, the harsh words, the relentless work, and the loneliness that had weighed on her for months. She allowed herself to feel the grief and anger she had suppressed, acknowledging the pain without letting it define her. She reminded herself that she had survived, that she had grown stronger, and that she had the right to pursue a life of dignity and happiness. Upon arriving in town, Clara found temporary work, earning her own wages and gaining a sense of independence she had never experienced. For the first time in her life, she felt in control of her circumstances. She interacted with people who treated her with kindness and respect, people who valued her efforts and listened to her thoughts. These small interactions were transformative. Each act of genuine human connection reminded her that life could be different. That kindness existed beyond the rare gestures she had received from Daniel, and that she was capable of building a life of her own choosing. As she settled into this new chapter, Clara also allowed herself to reflect on her relationship with Daniel. Their bond had grown slowly, quietly, and with great care. He had shown her that love could be patient, that trust could be rebuilt even after betrayal and neglect, and that partnership was about respect and support rather than control and criticism. She realized that this was a new kind of love, one that did not rush, one that allowed space for healing, and one that valued her autonomy. Over time, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. Daniel continued to show his care through quiet gestures, helping her when needed, offering advice only when asked, and celebrating her accomplishments without overshadowing them. Clara felt herself opening up more with each passing day, allowing him to see her fears, her hopes, and her dreams. She was cautious, aware of the scars she carried, but she trusted him in a way she had never trusted anyone before. Together, they discovered the joy of small, simple moments. They worked on the land, repaired fences, tended to the animals, and walked together in the evenings as the sun set across the fields. These moments were not grand or dramatic, but they were profound. Clara realized that love and companionship could exist in quiet consistency, in steady presence, and in shared effort. She learned that true partnership was not about grand gestures, but about respect, patience, and mutual care. As the months passed, Clara's confidence grew. She learned to make decisions for herself, to trust her judgment, and to assert her needs and boundaries. The life she had once feared, filled with uncertainty, loneliness, and harsh criticism, had transformed into one where she could exercise choice, independence, and self-respect. She began to dream not only of survival, but of thriving, of building a future that reflected her values and desires. Clara also took time to care for herself in ways she had neglected for years. She nurtured her health, cultivated friendships, and allowed herself moments of joy and creativity. She wrote in her journal, capturing her thoughts, feelings, and plans for the future. She explored the town, meeting people who became part of her growing support network. Each step of independence reinforced the lessons she had learned. That resilience was born from enduring hardship, that trust could be rebuilt, and that hope could flourish even after pain. One late afternoon, as Clara walked along the edge of a nearby river, the sun casting golden light across the water, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the letters she had written, the train ride across the country, the harsh reality of the ranch, and the quiet kindness of Daniel. She understood now that survival was not just about enduring hardship. It was about learning to recognize the good in the world, to trust wisely, and to take deliberate steps toward a better life. In that moment, Clara realized that she had become the person she had longed to be all along. She was no longer the timid, fearful young woman who had arrived at the ranch with hope trembling in her chest. She was strong, capable, and aware of her worth. She had learned to navigate pain, to protect herself, and to embrace kindness and trust when it was offered. And she knew, deep in her heart, that the future she imagined was no longer a distant dream. It was within reach. Her relationship with Daniel continued to grow, built on mutual respect and understanding. He never sought to control her, never demanded more than she was willing to give, and always treated her as an equal. Their bond was steady, rooted in shared experiences, patience, and genuine care. Clara understood that this was a love unlike any she had known, a love that did not seek to diminish her, but to stand beside her as she built a life of independence, hope, and fulfillment. Eventually, Clara made the decision to leave the town and start her own household with Daniel. They rented a small, welcoming home not far from the ranch, a place where she could continue to work, grow, and heal fully. She brought with her the lessons of resilience, the strength of independence, and the understanding that true partnership was built on respect, trust, and steady kindness. As she settled into her new life, Clara reflected on her journey. She thought about the letters, the train ride, the ranch, and the kindness of Daniel. She realized that every hardship had shaped her, every struggle had strengthened her, and every act of kindness had reminded her of the beauty and potential in the world. She understood that her past did not define her, but it had prepared her to recognize and embrace a life filled with dignity, love, and possibility. Standing together on their porch one evening, watching the sun set across the fields, Clara felt a profound sense of peace. The land that had once felt isolating now felt like a canvas for her life, a life she had chosen, built with patience, courage, and trust. She had survived abandonment, hardship, and fear, and in doing so, she had discovered her strength, her worth, and the possibility of a future filled with hope and companionship. Clara had once arrived as a frightened mail-order bride, seeking safety and survival. She had endured harshness, loneliness, and neglect, and she had grown stronger in ways she never imagined. And now, standing under the open sky with Daniel by her side, she realized that she had found something far more valuable than safety. She had found herself, her courage, and a life she could call her own. She had finally arrived at a place where she belonged, not because someone had saved her, but because she had chosen to rise, to trust, and to embrace the future she deserved. And under the endless sky, surrounded by fields, animals, and the quiet presence of someone who truly cared, Clara finally felt whole, free, and at home.